Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Jason Stanley, who's the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University and the author of How Propaganda Works, which was the winner of the 2016 Prose Award for Philosophy. His latest book is How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jason Stanley.
Thanks for having me on, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And on Friday at Mount Rushmore, Donald Trump, at the beginning of the 4th of July holiday, desecrated this lovely holiday where Americans celebrate, get together, no politics, just community, and a collective acknowledgement to the country and to its founding fathers and its founding principles. It's a cherished, and from one who was not born here but it's become an American citizen. I absolutely love these holidays along with Thanksgiving, and the idea that our president desecrated it with divisive, hateful language, even went so far as to talk about the radical ideology attacking our country advances under the banner of social justice, to dismiss all of the response that's happened since the killing of George Floyd in this country, and to turn that necessity into an attack on America itself. There he was with Mount Rushmore in the background, conflating those figures carved into the granite of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, as though they were about to be desecrated. So how did it strike you?
Well, it struck me as a classic example of what I describe in my book, How Fascism Works, as fascist politics. At the very core of fascism is the idea of a friend-enemy distinction, that there's no reasonable dialogue possible with your enemy. They are out to destroy your tradition, destroy your past, destroy your civilization, and so they must be met with by force and not dialogue. And the president was doing two things in his speech. First, he was enacting this kind of fascist ideology that the opponent is illegitimate. The opponent is seeking to destroy your traditions. They're not seeking to have a society with you. They're a mortal threat to your civilization. It was very reminiscent of a 1935 speech that Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, gave, called Communism with Its Mask Off, when he represents the thing that the Nazi party is protecting you from as a force that is going to destroy your religion, destroy your civilization, destroy all of your values. So that is a very common trope, because in this kind of authoritarian way of thinking, there's only one legitimate viewpoint. The Republican Party has, for many years, been treating the Democratic Party as if they're not a legitimate opposition party, as if they're an enemy that is an enemy of the United States. This is autocracy, authoritarian thinking. There's only one legitimate party, ours. And the second thing that Trump is doing is he is projecting. He is taking that ideology that he himself has, and he is projecting it onto protesters, legitimate democratic protesters. He's projecting the view that your enemy is an enemy of civilization itself, and there's no reasonable discourse, onto liberals and progressives. So he's enacting a kind of fascist ideology of declaring any kind of political opposition to be illegitimate and a threat to the nation. And then he's projecting that view and saying, and actually that's the view that that the protesters have.
Well, he doubled down in his Salute to America address on Saturday in Washington, D.C., proclaiming that he was defeating the radical left, the Marxists, the anarchists, the agitators, the looters, and people who, in many instances, have absolutely no clue what they're doing. And he pledged, of course, to safeguard our values. Now, on a Monday, he attacked the only black NASCAR driver, again revealing his racism, which is hardly the subtext anymore. I mean, everything he's saying basically is that these black people are getting too uppity and you white people have got to put them down again.
Yes, yeah, he's representing black equality as a fundamental threat to his conception of the nation. So that tells you much about what he means about by the nation. It tells you about, it informs you of his vision of what the greatness of America consists in, which is figures like Andrew Jackson, who, while complex, also were representative of genocide of indigenous people and other horrors in our past. So his vision is that of an American. One always had to ask the question: what does he mean about making America great again? And what he means quite clearly is return it to a racial hierarchy. And when people are challenging that racial hierarchy, when people are asking for racial equality, which is a cry and a plea that is not local to this presidency. It occurred under the previous president, Obama. It is a long-standing feature. We have this enormous racism, structural racism in our country. And he's labeling protests against that as a threat to what America is. So suggesting America for him is this racial hierarchy.
So is this going to work? Is this a desperate attempt? I mean, he keeps pandering to his base, and that's roughly 30% of the country. And I think 30% of the country has always been susceptible to racism and fascism, and it goes back, I think, to the Confederacy, which is very much Trump's constituency. And at no time in either of his speeches at Mount Rushmore or in Washington on Saturday did Trump ever refer to these Confederate monuments. He was, again, trying to conflate it as though they were going after those hallowed founding fathers on Mount Rushmore.
Well, again, we recall Charlottesville, our good people on both sides comment. He has shown clearly that he regards he's already rejected renaming military bases after traitors to that are now named after traitors to the United States. He's rejected renaming them. So I mean, you can only imagine what the world would think if Germany insisted on keeping the name of military installations named after members of the prominent members of the Nazi Party. So he's already rejected that, even though Republicans, there was bipartisan support for renaming them. So he's made clear that he considers the Confederate monuments erected during the Jim Crow era as part of memory of of quote unquote our heroes. So I think there's no ambiguity there that he means that the Confederate monuments should be kept up as a monument to what he thinks of as American greatness.
Well, again, I'm speaking to Jason Stanley, the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University and the author of How Propaganda Works, which was a winner of the 2016 Prose Award for Philosophy. His latest book is How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. And the divisions of us and them were sadly on display, both on Friday at Mount Rushmore, with the president speaking to an entirely white audience, issued the most outrageous claims about what was actually happening in this country and demonizing people and demonizing the very concept of social justice. So, yes. Again, I get back. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, let's get to that for one moment, the way he demonized social justice. Because again, we find classic projection. He spoke of cancel culture. He spoke of the left, social justice movements trying to cancel people and get people fired. Let's take a step back and think about who's responsible for attacking academics, people in the media for their speech and trying to get them fired. Mr. Trump gave, if I'm not mistaken, he addressed Turning Point USA's annual conference. What is Turning Point USA? Turning Point USA is an organization that was headed by Charlie Kirk that arose to get professors fired for their speech, particularly on social media. They started out with a professor watch list. That's how they announced themselves. They were only the most radical of a string of organizations on the right, in right-wing media, that were like Breitbart, for instance, and in a way, Fox News, that were designed to create outrage and ultimately with consequences for a person's career, reputation, and life about speech. The right wing has been canceling people since McCarthy, and the right wing's organizations completely devoted to canceling people for their speech, such as Turning Point USA, Breitbart, College Fix, a list of others. These are right-wing organizations entirely or devoted to cancel culture. So again, what we have is we have projection. I'm not the fascist, you are. He even said, you're left-wing fascists.
Well, but Trump, in his usual style, was being both the arsonist and the fire brigade. And as he offered this completely false narrative about what's happening into the country today and demonizing the very people, demonizing the concept of social justice and the very people who are crying out for social justice. And by the way, they're not just Black Lives Matter. If you look at these demonstrations, there are an awful lot of young white kids as well. And the country is definitely not the same country that Donald Trump has in his memory, and certainly in his father's memory, who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So the part that I found scary in terms of the overall fascist whiff of this speech was when he made these false charges and displaced all the very things that he's doing onto the so-called enemy. He would turn to the audience of white people and say, and I'm not going to let it happen. That's when I really gave me chills. It seemed full-on fascist.
Well, it was very reminiscent of fascist rhetoric and fascist speeches. Again, the Goebbels 1935 speech, Communism with its mask off, Goebbels represents the Nazi Party as kind of the strongmen people who will protect the traditional German people from the monster, the totalitarian monster that they face. The difference between Goebbels and Trump here is not, unfortunately, one that speaks in Trump's favor. Goebbels, there were actually Bolsheviks back then, and the Bolsheviks did pose a serious threat to freedom and democracy and liberty and everything we hold dear. But now the threat is not Bolshevism. It's people asking for racial justice and people asking for economic justice. And yes, some people misbehave and some people go overboard in their tactics on social media. But to try to pull with young progressives what Goebbels pulled with Bolsheviks is horrifying. Young progressives are not seeking to end religion. They're not seeking to infringe on anyone's traditions. They're seeking equality for racial minorities, for sexual minorities, for justice for immigrants, and economic justice for their generation whose future has been robbed by predatory capitalism, superpowered by this administration.
Well, just in the last couple of minutes, Jason Stanley, there was a kind of unfortunate and scary harbinger of what could happen in Trump's base and the radical elements and the heavily armed elements of his base, heeding Trump's call to stop this radical left-wing Marxist takeover of America. Back in mid-June in the small town of Bethel, Ohio, there was a very modest gathering in support of Black Lives Matter, and all the bikers from all around came and beat the hell out of these people. And it's starting to happen all over. And do you think that that's what we're going to have in this election season? that kind of chaos, much worse than Nixon's law and order period when he sicked the hard hats onto the anti-war protesters. This time it could be bloody, and it could be right across the country.
Well, that's the concern. I mean, fascism involves paramilitary groups egged on by the fascist social and political movement. And it looks like we have a president of the United States who's calling on paramilitary organizations. He did this with COVID, calling to liberate the states, and he's clearly doing it here. The question is, will there be the kind of systematic paramilitary group violence that is associated with the rise of fascist regimes and the transition of fascist regimes into power? That's the question. I guess I believe too much in America to think that that will be successful, but that might be idealistic.
Well, it is frightening and almost unbelievable that a president of the United States could have these beliefs and be this irresponsible and not care about binding the wounds of this country, and having Abraham Lincoln up there behind him at Mount Rushmore, the very exemplar of binding the wounds. The irony is just so sad. This is a sad time in America, and one only hopes that the better angels will emerge, particularly in November.
Yes, and as these protests about George Floyd remind us, this problem is not new. Almost 10% of the world's prison population is Black American. There's only 38 million, 40 million Black Americans. The racial wealth gap is 10 to 1. The average white family is 10 times the wealth of the average Black family. So these are systemic problems, and Trump seems to be, these are systemic structural problems, and Trump is representing the attempt to deal with these problems, to deal with an over-militarized police, which is let's be clear, an over-militarized police, a prison system gone awry. These are problems for poor whites, poor blacks. They're problems for America, regardless of race. And Trump is representing the attempt to deal with these problems as a threat to American greatness.
Well, Jason Stanley, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Jason Stanley, who's the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University and the author of How Propaganda Works, which was the winner of the 2016 Prose Award for Philosophy. And his latest book is How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into the cumulative effect of books by the axis of adults, warning the public about our dangerously ill-informed and hate-filled leader.